Welcome to another virtual Live Talks Los Angeles event. We welcome Lisa Napoli, Susan Stamberg, and Linda Wertheimer to our series. We invite you to visit and subscribe to our YouTube channel for over 300 conversations. Follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. Our handle is Live Talks LA. Lisa's book is Susan, Linda, Nina, and Cokie, The Extraordinary Story of the Founding Mothers of NPR. Lisa has had a long career in journalism, including staff reporting jobs at Public Radio's Marketplace, the pioneering New York Times CyberTimes, and as a columnist and correspondent at MSNBC. She is the author, most recently, of Up All Night, Ted Turner, CNN, and the Birth of 24-Hour News. Susan Stamberg is a special correspondent for NPR. She is the first woman to anchor a national nightly news program. She has been on staff since the network began in 1971. Beginning in 1972, she served as co-host of All Things Considered for 14 years. She then hosted Weekend Edition Sunday and now reports on cultural issues for Morning Edition and Weekend Edition Saturday. Linda Wertheimer is a senior national correspondent at NPR. She joined NPR at the network's inception and served as All Things Considered's first director, starting with its debut on May 3rd, 1971. In the more than 40 years since, she has served NPR in a variety of roles, including reporter and host. I am Ted Haptegaber, founder and producer of the series. They will talk, and towards the end, I will pose some questions that came from you in the audience. Take it from here, Lisa.
Thank you, Ted. This is an entirely awkward situation because I wrote a book about Susan, Linda, Nina, and Cokie without anybody's permission. I just sort of dropped into their lives. I dropped into NPR's orbit and has spent the pandemic in a delightful way, mining old materials, nudging you guys with questions, you ladies with questions, and reading and your books and watching endless videos, which exist in multiple forms on C-SPAN in particular. There's some tremendous interviews that you've done that have included you over the years. So basically, I spent the pandemic year with you by your side. And now I'm so honored and grateful to you for agreeing to talk with me, because talking with you is way more interesting than having me talk about what I found out about the beginning of public radio.
You know more than we do by now. Well, Lisa, excuse me, but you've done I love this book, and you've just done a terrific job at it, and the depth of your research and the breadth of it, and coming up with stories that none of us remembered, and just little detail. So thank you for it.
Thank you
I
so
agree.
much.
Very lively, very
That
compelling.
It means so much. And it was a really hard and strange assignment to tell the story of the birth of NPR through your eyes. And that's why I've loved in the last 12 years becoming a biographer and getting out of daily journalism, because it lets you dig deep and also synthesize. And of course, you're all amazingly well-known, well-regarded people, but I, of course, knew nothing about anything beyond before you became well-regarded, famous radio people. So that's what I wanted to sort of focus on today, is let's talk about the beginning of NPR, which no one ever talks about except occasionally, and about your beginnings too. And I want to start, even though Linda came first to NPR, was the first hire in the bunch, I want to start with Susan, only because Susan was in educational radio before it was called public radio. And Susan, I just wanted to talk about how you were a young married woman bored with a secretarial job, and how you walked into this little tiny station that was just starting out, WAMU in Washington, and knew nothing about radio, had no aspirations about radio. Let's talk about that first job in radio that you landed basically kind of almost accidentally, right?
I would say ignorance is bliss. On the other hand, radio was, because I'm so antique, radio was the glamour medium of my childhood. This was way before television. And so I always thought, oh, extraordinary. And I would never have had those aspirations. You have to understand, my generation was very peculiar and limited. We women, many of us, I think you did too, Linda, wanted to work for some brilliant man. I mean, my best vision was that I'd find some fascinating male and get a great job with him. I think that was one of Nina's goals as well.
I picked
So-
Edward R. Murrow.
Oh, yeah, that
I
was
wanted to
good.
go to work for Edward R. Murrow.
Yeah, well, I would have gone to work for him as well, yes. Or George Clooney had he only been alive. Nonetheless, so it didn't occur to me to apply, but I got
Gonna get up.
really so bored, thankfully, at this magazine job. It was the New Republic magazine, and all I was doing was typing because that's what women in my generation did. Or unless they'd gotten married and out of college and instantly had children. But these were the great ambitions of that generation of women. But I got bored at the New Republic typing, and so I started calling around, and I made such a pest of myself having heard of this new little skinny network, which was a precursor of NPR. And many of the very first people who went to work at NPR at the beginning had started at that skinny little network, only 12 stations that went along the East Coast. I called the guy at American University where the Washington station was based, and I called him every week. And I think it was that he got so sick and tired of hearing from me that he simply hired me to quit the phone calls. And that's how it started. But it turned out once NPR began that I had more on the air experience than anybody else on the staff. Linda had lots of broadcasting experience, not broadcasting experience, but working in broadcasting at wonderful institutions. I did not. I only had this one. I've actually only had 2 jobs in radio, and that was the first, WMU, which has become a powerhouse in our network, and NPR. Otherwise, a few years at Voice of America. But Linda had BBC, you had CBS radio in New York, right?
Right.
Right.
And
So,
WCBS News Radio 88,
which was
which when I went to work for them had just switched to an all news format and was chasing Wins, which was the first station to go all news.
WI.
And it was quite a lot of fun. And I think that, I keep telling young humans that the best advice I can give them is to go to work for a startup. There's room to move at a startup. And they're really, the rest of it, if you go to work for an established organization, you'll find that we already have our women. People said that to me. People have ideas about how things ought to be, and you can't change them. But a new place is a whole new world.
we got to do everything.
NPR was a particularly whole new world because FM radio wasn't established, NPR wasn't established. And I want to just go back to what it was like for each of you when you walked in the door there, because it wasn't, like you say, nobody knew what it was because it hadn't even started yet. You made it all of you made it all up. So Linda, when you had come from CBS, you had moved to DC because you got married, as did Susan.
As I did.
Your problem was that at CBS, they wouldn't allow women on the air. What was that whole?
Well, it was so awful. I came from the BBC, where I worked for a couple, for a year and a half, something like that, for the World Service of the BBC. Now, in that place, there were a lot of women. There were women producers, women directors, women engineers, and I didn't quite realize why it was. So I asked, and they said, the war. The men all went away, and not all of them came back.
Mm-hmm.
Women replaced them while they were gone and fought to hold on to the jobs when they came back. So I had been in a setting where there were a tremendous number of very, very good women, and producers, editors, and even presenters. Even at the BBC and places that were trying to, that were making a virtue of necessity by having women on the air, they had a lot of very good women, not as many on air as there were in the background, but still around here, the US of A, they weren't even in the background.
Yeah.
So then I came back to the United States, and I found another startup, WCBS. Now that was nothing, nothing was going to happen to me there, because they were an offshoot of CBS, and they had all of the guys worked for them who were CBS guys, and there were a couple of women on that staff, reporters, and I was very excited about that until they sat down and told me what it was like to be them and hear themselves taken out, edited out of their own pieces. And if they got a nice clip of tape, which was making news, they didn't get to introduce it. They were gone from it. And it was, what a discouraging situation that was.
So so women were allowed to go out into the field with a microphone, but they
Not
weren't
very many,
allowed,
but yes.
yeah, not very
Yes.
many, but they weren't allowed to ever put their name or their voice.
The voices.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
But we
So
had a
Mary
great advantage.
Pandelis was an
Lisa,
example
we
of
had a
that.
great advantage, as Linda will agree, in public radio. I took a salary cut to get that first job, to leave the New Republic and go to that local station. And I could because I was married and I had a husband who provided really the income in the house. I was just sort of the side, in the coin purse, and he occupied the wallet. And we could afford to do that because we had two salaries. And that was true for, it was true for you, Linda, and it was true for the women who were starting. If they were married, there were a lot of single ones too, from the very beginning at NPR, young ones who met and married very often once they landed at NPR. I'm the list keeper of NPR met and married list. And the last time I looked, there were 75 couples.
Wow.
Oh, but
Now,
of course, we just had our 50th anniversary. What?
Part of the reason why that happened was we made them work so hard. They never got to meet anybody who didn't work at
He
NPR.
never went outside. And also the hours. Once morning went on, the marriage quotient really bumped up because they worked 24 hours. There's a whole nighttime staff too. It was much more quiet and private then.
Right.
But that's a whole other story.
Well, before we even get to that point, because that is good, juicy stuff, although I think it's true of a lot of newsrooms, and hopefully the marriages last, because in a lot of them they don't. But
Many do.
let's talk about what NPR looked like when you first walked into it, when it wasn't even on the air yet, and nobody had a sense of the vision, where it was going to go. I mean, maybe a small vision. It was the Public Broadcasting Act had given birth to a pool of money, a tiny sliver of which was dedicated to the concept of a national public radio network that was intelligent radio, but nobody knew what that intelligent stuff was going to be. And Linda, so when you walked in the door, what did they say? And what did you say? What was it like? I know you interacted with Bill Seymour, the founding father of NPR.
I did. Bill was doing the hiring, the initial hiring. They started out with administrative people and people who would help to set the thing up. And then they started hiring people who would be working with the programs. And I was one of the first ones they hired. I think that Bill only hired me because I had, my father owned a grocery store and I delivered groceries when I was a kid. I mean, he took that to mean that I was of the people and that I worked. But his first impression of me was that I had been to Wellesley, and that was not a good thing in his eyes. It was a good thing, but it was just not what he wanted. He wanted more, an earthier crowd to run the place.
Right.
But he hired me, thank goodness. The first day I reported for work, I asked the kind of question that you might ask at any job: where do I sit? And the answer was, we don't have any chairs. They had no furniture. There was no furniture. So we all sat around the walls of the largest room in the place, and we talked about what we were going to do and what it was going to sound like. And Bill gave his sermon about how it should sound and how it would be like real people, and we would not be yelling the news into the ears of people who are driving along in their cars, that we would be talking to them, and that we would try to get enough of them to talk to us, that we would have a sense of who our audience was and what they were about.
Let me just tell a really specific example of Bill educating us, because sitting on the floor there with a big old tape recorder, reel to reel, we have been asked to bring in examples of work that we had done that we were proud of. And at this local station, I had produced a weekly public affairs discussion program. I was not on the air. So I brought in that tape, and I had gotten, it was on the campus of the American University. And I had brought in to the station to be my announcer, a student with a good male, with a good deep voice. And the tape I brought began, "Welcome to a federal case." That's as far as the tape got. And Bill said, "That's exactly how we don't want to sound." And I thought, what? Can he be serious? But boy, did I take it seriously. You know, that was the first great lesson from him, realizing he doesn't want some voice from the top of the mountain. He wants the voice across the back fence of your house.
And the top of the mountain voice was pretty much it. And
That's what there was. That's what there
And
was.
pretty much always male,
And pretty
Always
much
male.
since women don't sound like God, oddly enough.
Right.
which is funny because everybody thinks that you sound like God.
Right.
So you fooled them, right? But you did fool them, because what happened was really, Bill exited early on in NPR, and the two of you were there in those earliest days when there was just that one show. And basically, you all had to do every job, which is
Everyone.
frustrating, but also
It was
fantastic.
wonderful. It was
Very
wonderful.
educational, certainly.
Right.
I really drew the short straw. I was the director of the program, which meant that I would sit in there and I would ask whoever passed by the door, "Where is the next tape? Where is it?" And they would say, "I think it was." It was just horrible. And we had a lot of scary moments. Noah Adams once said that in the early days, you hope to God you knew what the first piece on the air was going to be. You certainly did not expect to know what the next piece would be.
And
it was just
the producers,
the
we were both
tension
hired.
was just-
We were both hired as to be production assistants. So we were out there slicing magnetic tape, which comes on big reels like movies, except
Round, it's
the
brown
quarter of the
stuff,
sound,
about that
big
wide.
round reels. And producers would go racing into the control room and throw the reels across to the engineer to thread it up and get it done. And it was like dodging, discs or bombs, maybe, who knew? And there was one time when a tape went up and it started to play and it was unintelligible. And I raced in and I said, hey, that's, you've got that tape on backwards. Lift it off and flip it around. For some reason, somebody didn't rewind it the proper way. It's backwards. And so they did. And it was even worse. And somebody else rushed in and said, put it back the way it was the first time. It's Russian. Linda, I think you were not, I hope you were not directing that. You didn't last very long as a director. You started doing other kinds of stuff.
I every time I could get an opportunity to get out the door with the tape recorder in my hand, I took it.
Yeah.
I was convinced that I could make them put me on the air. But first I had to, I had to do a few things so they could hear it. So I hit upon something that was almost as fashionable as women's rights were at the time, and that was consumers' rights. Consumers, well, it was a very big part of the news then. Ralph Nader had just been born. It was I got into that and I did a good job at it. And then they would, every once in a while, they'd have something else to do and I would jump. So I fought my way onto the air and I got there.
Well, and also
And
that
it
reflects,
was
that reflects part of Bill's thinking, his philosophy, and also the fact that by and large in the beginning, we had to be, because of the power of the three commercial networks and the quality of the news that they were doing in those days, which was far higher than it is now, we had to be alternative. We had to be thinking of other things. So we could go on the air with her doing consumer issues. I later could as the host, lobby for us to be talking about child raising and family and elder care and the need to pay attention to that, and abortion. I mean, just all of those subjects that were not women's issues, they were human issues, but nobody was talking about them, particularly not on a news broadcast.
Right.
So that was it. The idea of being alternative gave us a lot of really interesting things that nobody else was touching.
Susan, tell us about how when you became host, it was Jack Mitchell, as I understand it, who was a producer. He was finally anointed the daily producer. Nobody else was actually doing that on a.
No one was in charge.
Yeah, and except Linda with her whiteboard and keeping track of things in the earliest days. But when you were named host, there was some pushback, and it was because you were a woman.
Yes. Oh, exactly. Station managers called. I don't know how many there were. I think in those days we had maybe 68 stations. So of those 68, maybe 10, which would have been a lot, called to object, not to me, but probably to Bill and the president of the company, et cetera, to say a woman's voice is not authoritative. She will not be taken seriously. This is a mistake. We shouldn't be doing this, because they had never heard this before. Now, granted, there may have been some piece of truth in that. We had, it was a 5 kc telephone line. It wasn't a good quality because there were no satellites in those days. And so the quality of the line and the quality of the sound was probably not as good. And maybe it boosted treble, although you can hear I don't have much, rather than let me have a little more rounded sound and more bass to it. But otherwise, it was a prejudice against hearing that. And I have to say this thing about Bill, because I admire him so much, and I'm so grateful to him, as is Linda, for he hired us. He didn't tell me that for 11 years. I'd been around a while by then and been doing it for quite a long time. And I feel that he didn't, he decided not to, because it would affect me in some way. Mm-hmm. And he didn't want that to happen. He had great confidence in me and the way I sounded and my taste, and the kinds of things that I was interested in that he wanted to hear on the radio. So he never told it. And he knew it would throw me if I'd known it. And I tried to change things, and he was perfectly happy with it. And he also knew, because listeners really do get used to things after a while, that the criticism would fade away. And people would get used to, become comfortable with this brand new and to them very strange sound. So that's a quality of his leadership, though, that he stood by his people.
Absolutely. No, and you both contributed, you were both on the air, and then all of a sudden along comes, a couple years along comes Nina as utility reporter.
Right.
Basically, I think it was Bob Zelnick who hired her, I think. And
Bob Zelnick,
needed somebody to be what Nina still is today, which is a workhorse. And
absolutely, she is the energizing bunny. I tell you, the woman never stops, and she never will. That's the thing.
She was breaking stories.
Yeah.
And NPR was, we were kind of cruising around on the fringes, doing as Susan says, picking up stories that we thought were interesting and would interest our audience, but we were not necessarily going right there trying to get ahead of the crowd on big stories. And Nina, that was what Nina brought to the table. And she was awfully good at it, is awfully good at it.
And it was Watergate time. And so she was, Linda you were doing a lot of on-air work during
I was your basic House, I covered the House committee, the Judiciary Committee. And it was, Nina was, at that point, Nina was doing work at the courts. There was a tremendous amount of as there was, with this impeachment, there were a tremendous amount of lawsuits and court cases and whatnot. And Nina was very busy with that. I was at the Judiciary Committee, and it was such an extraordinary thing. It was so different from the way that it happened this time. But I mean, when they actually called the roll on the articles of impeachment in the Judiciary Committee, members were sitting up there with tears rolling down their faces. They were so frightened about what they were doing. They felt it was so tragic that it had come to this, that the American president should be impeached. And I remember Peter Rodino with tears running down his face. It was the most dramatic, I think the most dramatic moment in politics that I can recall.
Mm.
I mean, there are things that have happened, like, the death of John Kennedy was a huge moment and all those kinds of, but this was a group of men. There were some women. Barbara Jordan, remember Barbara Jordan? Spoke about the Constitution, which did not mention me, she said. The Constitution. She was there. There were a number of women, but not very many. And they were all, I think, they felt they were doing what they had to do, but they were terrified by it, and they weren't sure what was going to happen. And would the sun come up tomorrow, or would the United States fall into some kind of a pit as a result? And
Linda,
it was just amazing.
I think we as broadcasters felt that too. It was really hard to hold on to our own feeling and horror and shock by what we were seeing, an attack on an American president, and how all the institutions of government worked and how well they worked in a situation like that. And it was really a bipartisan time. I mean, there was such a thing as consensus. That may interest you, that Republicans and Democrats could reach agreement on matters. Maybe young people today have not witnessed that if they're young enough.
And I'm so glad that you both mentioned that, because really the media have played a role in that, arguably. I mean, that impeachment, there was no 24-hour news. There was no C-SPAN, right? So what we could see back then.
C-SPAN, I take responsibility for C-SPAN.
You're part of the C-SPAN. Yes, you inspired C-SPAN from the Panama Canal hearings. Is that what you mean? Is that what?
Yeah, right, from the Panama Canal treaty debates. Well, I don't know. Do you want to jump to that, or?
Yeah, sure. I think it's important because you've not only participated witnessed, but you've participated in the creation of, or the changes in media that have made NPR and all media different, more reactive than it ever had to be. So yeah, let's talk about how you were a pioneer and the network was a pioneer. Again, I just want to say briefly too, when Nina was breaking stories, when all of you were doing what you were doing, NPR still wasn't NPR. It was still this sort of sideways network. Right. And it's much harder to break stories when you work for a second tier, or what's perceived as a second tier outlet, than when you're at the New York Times, right? Everybody expects the news to be broken there. So when you were anchoring the Panama Canal Treaty hearings in 1978, right? That was unprecedented. That there would be
the Congress had permitted for some time, the deliberations that have legislation headed for the floor. There were committee meetings, all kinds of things like that, which we could go to, and some of them we did broadcast, but we had never been able to broadcast the debates on the floor of the House or Senate. And so Frank Mankiewicz, who was by then the president of NPR, he was the third or fourth president of NPR. Anyway, he marched down to the Capitol, called on Robert C. Byrd, who was then the leader in the House, in the Senate. And he said, here's what we should do. This is going to be, it was clear that the American people did not believe that we should give the Panama Canal back to anybody. We stole it and it's ours. That was the commonly voiced feeling about it. Mm-hmm. And so what Frank basically did was tell and convince Robert Byrd that the more people knew about how important it was, what it meant, the more people knew, the more they would be likely to agree that this should happen. Now, Byrd was, we think of him now as a man who made very long speeches and was very conservative and was from West Virginia. But in fact, he was a very talented politician. He understood what he was looking at. And he made some very amazing, and I still think quite remarkable decisions. And that one of them was to let us into the Senate. We sat up on the, actually we didn't sit in the main, the print press side of the gallery. We were in the radio side of the gallery. And we were up there with little desks, which we had built for us to, which were built for us to use. And we had, all the equipment that we needed to, and Gary Henderson, who was a good friend of Robert Byrd's because he was the anchor of a bluegrass show on a local radio station, WAMU. And Byrd loved him and thought that, and they talked during the course. So he came up to where we were sitting several times. He was incredibly kind and helpful. It was, we were not in the sort of rank partisan warfare, which we are now. We had, when they would have a recess or they were having a vote or something, Robert Siegel was back in the NPR studios and he was interviewing people. And then sometimes people would come up to where I was sitting. They had to be members of the Senate pretty much, but I would talk to them. It was an extraordinary thing, but the thing about it was that it was just so infuriating. It was such a pile of information that we had to deal with. What I had to learn about the rules of the Senate was terrifying. But I think that by the end of that, I could have been parliamentarian. I should have gone for that job.
Yes, you should have run for office for sure. Well, and so you did that. Now, there is no one thing that put NPR on the map.
Well, a lot of, yes, there were. And what mentioned the name of one of them, and that was Frank Mankiewicz. And I need to tell your LA viewers who he is, because he was Hollywood royalty. His father was Herman Mankiewicz, the subject of a film now, which is nominated for Best Picture, Mank. He wrote Citizen Kane. And so Frank grew up in that world. His son, Ben, by the way, I don't know if he's still doing Turner Classic Movies, but he was an anchor of that, one of the stand-up guys for quite some time. So they know their Hollywood, they know their LA. And Frank had been the spokesman for Bobby Kennedy. And he was the one who told the world that Bobby had been shot. He came to us some years after that as our president, and he was known. He was nationally known. So lots and lots of journalists and journalism institutions, newspapers in particular, wanted to come and talk to him, interview him, and that was the beginning of putting us on the map because he got a tremendous amount of press and ink for us. Another one was Nina Totenberg, who started breaking these stories. And when she broke the story of Anita Hill and Hill's accusations against Clarence Thomas, that went global.
Right.
It got us tremendous amount of attention. So incrementally, I sat in the Oval Office of President Jimmy Carter and did a live call-in show. That got paid to on New York Times things, so gradually over time. It still took a while, and we were known. I used to say we're the best kept secret in broadcasting, and we were. We never had money to buy ads, to do any sort of publicity at all. It had to be word of mouth, and the audience grew and built that way.
Or to what?
We were unable to fly, wherever we wanted to. We just didn't have money.
Right. And another important thing that Frank Mankiewicz did was he hired Cokie.
You bet.
He
Yes, he
signed
did.
off on the hiring of Cokie. Yeah. And so I'm sorry that Nina's not here to tell the story about retrieving Cokie's resume from her desperate husband who was trying to help her get a job now that they'd moved back to Washington for his job at the Washington Post. But I'm sure, Linda, you
It
can
was the New York Times.
Sorry, the New York Times.
Yeah.
Wow, what a gaffe that is. Such a native New Yorker.
Oh, it's okay. Post was doing pretty well in those days.
Those-
Oh, yeah.
that was my home newspaper for sure.
Yeah,
Sorry about that. Thank you for catching me. But
That's fine.
so Nina runs back into the newsroom with this resume, and you're all excited about another woman. She's also a Wellesley graduate like you, Linda. And you have this women's college mafia going on with Barnard's. But before that was a thing in media. But Linda, what was that like that day when Nina came in and when Cokie came in? Cokie Roberts was like, none of you at that point was in your names in all caps. So what was that like when she first arrived?
Well, I was obviously of two minds. I thought that it would be great to have Cokie come to work for us. But on the other hand, I figured they'd give my job to Cokie. I was covering Congress and politics, and I thought, whoops, there it goes. You know, I had to spend a lot of time getting to know the members of Congress, getting to know how the Congress worked, following all kinds of bills. You know, I had a big argument once with one of the leaders at NPR about the Farm Bill. I said, you know you don't think the Farm Bill is any fun at all, but almost all of our audience lives in the Middle West at this moment. So the Farm Bill is a big deal for us. We should be covering it. Anyway, I knew that Cokie would be a great asset. But the thing that was interesting, and I think this is still something that young women have to deal with, and that is that Cokie was not ever interested in plowing anybody else under in order to get ahead. It's just not how Cokie was made. So what we did was we actually kind of negotiated how this would work. We would both be on the Hill, and we would have the House and the Senate, and whichever one of us wanted, we would trade off. Cokie really hated the Senate. Most of the big news stories came out of the Senate. So the Senate I got first refusal of the Senate, and then Cokie was centered on the House. When we got to an election year, we made a decision that I would get on the plane and that Cokie would chase the voters. And it worked out wonderfully well for us. Mm-hmm. But the thing that made it work was that we were willing to share. We were willing to do that. And, in every other place that I'd ever worked, there was such a lot of just cutthroat competition that you could not have done that. Now, it was partly because, Cokie was such a nice, saintly person, and I was trying to be a nice, saintly person like her. But it was also because we were so damn busy. We had a huge morning show. By that time, we had a huge morning show. We had a huge evening show, and we had to file all the time. So we did not have the opportunity to get into fights. It was not efficient to get into fights. We were having a terrible time just trying to keep our heads above water.
There was something else there too, and that is she and I were the only mothers. I mean, not founding mothers, although Linda and I were that, but mothers. We had children, and it meant a tremendous amount to Cokie that she could hand off to Linda when she had to, when the burner of home got really hot and she had to pay attention there. I had my wonderful husband who would sort of split his day. He was a civil servant with me. And so I could stay home in the morning, but we went on the air at 5 o'clock in those days. And so midday, I would go in and he would come home with our little boy if that were necessary, if he needed attention or if he wasn't feeling well. We could job share that way. But those women could job share because of, to a large extent, do it so successfully because they were a team and Cokie had those children.
It's
Well,
also a lot of kismet too. You go, Linda. I want to hear what you have to say.
I was just going to say that that I, of course, having no children, I had no idea what to say to them. I mean, Rebecca called up once and she said,
That's the
"Mom's
daughter.
not
That's
home, and I've
Cokie's
been
daughter.
invited to a party." The daughter, Cokie and Steve's daughter, Rebecca. "I've been invited to a party, and I said, no, you can't go, because Cokie hasn't said you can go." Well, I think Rebecca got very clear on the fact pretty quickly that I was just a way conservative mother, and her mother was not anything like as conservative as I was. But then, of course, she wasn't my daughter. I mean, what would I have done if something had happened?
was easy.
Oh my God.
Right.
That was easy.
Right.
And when Nina came, you haven't asked us about what it was like. Are you getting to that, or do you care?
Oh,
What it was like when she walked in?
Oh, of course I care.
Yeah.
Yes, I skipped ahead out of, because we talked a little bit about it, Nina being a utility player, but no, what
Yeah.
was it like when she
Yeah,
walked?
well, she was the best dressed among. She, for her life, has spent a fortune on clothes and always looks great. And we never had the money really to do that, or maybe the inclination, but now she came in and I never forgot the coat that she was wearing and some kind of fur trim and all of that. And I tell you, she was a tank from day one. She walked into that place and she elbowed her way through. And it shows you, I mean, it was just so reflective of the drive that she's got. She never quits and she gets what she wants. And she doesn't have to be a good, nice girl all the time in order to get it. In the end, she is so successful at it and does it so brilliantly. That's
Well,
neat. And she's still so well dressed.
It's so interesting too that it didn't really matter what medium she was working in. She wasn't working in radio. And unlike Linda, who wanted to be in broadcasting, and you who back-ended into broadcasting, Susan, and Cokie had done radio before she walked in the door. Nina, it was just.
That's right, just print.
her
Well,
work.
print. But she was
Yeah.
a writer.
Yeah.
And that's the secret of any good broadcaster. So
Right. Excellent writer and drive and Energizer bunny, as you said.
And she
Right.
has all those funny things which have become trademarks for her, you know, where she does her point by point
she does the
explanation
dialogue of
of
the day.
complicated, yeah, or performs back in the day when the Supreme Court was not recorded, which basically started in the middle of last week. I mean, it's very recent. She would read the transcripts, and they were transcripts that she had basically written while listening to the debate, but then she would go and check with the clerks. Nina always said that the Supreme Court was one of the, I mean, you know this about the Congress, but I didn't know this about the court, that having friends in low places is always important.
Mhm.
And to know the clerks and to know the people who are transcribing, and to know that where you could go to get, you know, an absolutely perfect quote that the justice would not come down and behead you over. It was she was really tough about it. But you know, we had days when I remember a day when she came in and she said, "Okay, I'm going on the air. I'm going to lead the show. I need this, I need that, I need something else. Linda, you call so-and-so. Cokie, you gonna," and we were her researchers and we did it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
The other thing that's amazing about Nina is that she doesn't have a legal degree. In fact, she never graduated from college, and she's talked a lot about that.
It's a great advantage.
For her. Yeah, and it worked. She's a shining example of how that worked for her. I mean, she's a singular person, as you all are, but her, I mean, of course, but it's really fascinating, her trajectory. Can we talk a little bit about what is the difference for women today? When you look at the women who are working today, let's reflect a little bit on the media ecosystem and the role of women and the place of women in, how do you feel when you look at what's happening in the media now?
Look at MSNBC, for example. MSNBC has Rachel Maddow, who is their, the person that they think of as their biggest star. But there are all kinds of other huge stars. Nicole is there. I mean, just a huge number of people who are so smart, and all women. Their morning lineup. There are actually 2 men in the morning in their lineup through the day, but it's mostly women.
Mm-hmm.
And they are very good at what they do. I'm very impressed with them every time I watch it.
I don't watch television. I listen to us, and what I hear is women everywhere. One of the best broadcasters I've ever heard, Rachel Martin, who is doing our morning program at home with children and operating it herself, doing all her own engineering, and these extraordinary, compassionate, heartfelt interviews, as well as tough as nails ones as well. And there she is on that morning program, just holding the flag.
But we no longer stand out as the place that has a lot of women.
Yeah.
Lots of places have lots of women.
Yeah, wherever.
Even newspapers, even the great gray lady of the New York Times, who for so many years was one of the only ladies in the place.
Mm-hmm.
There are a lot of women working on the paper now. I think it's just Frank Mankiewicz got himself into all kinds of trouble when he observed that the reason that he had hired so many women was that he got more bang for the buck with women. Which was absolutely, it was true. It was true. Women, the really good guys were going to work for the New York Times. The really good women couldn't go to work at the New York Times. A lot of them went to work for us.
Yeah.
Right.
I mean, we were, it was like being the Little Ivies or something. It was a great possibility. But once again, it was a startup. And when you start up anything, you have all kinds of opportunities, and we took advantage of every opportunity we could get.
In the crisis in the early 80s that was precipitated by Frank's largesse, were you were concerned that things would not keep going, right? I mean, it was really.
Oh, you bet. We were borrowing paper for typing from CBS across the street. We were not sure whether our rent was going to be paid that week. Noah Adams and I went on the air on All Things Considered and raised, and this was big money in those days, $1 million directly from listeners in a week. And that was unheard of. And God bless the stations who let us do that. That made them nervous because they were fearful that the network would be taking away from the contributions they were also getting from their local listeners. But it worked out in the end. And that was the extent to which we had to go in order simply to keep on. But it was it was a terrible time.
It was terrible. And we had some important friends in the Congress who, spoke out for us. And we had important friends around the country who spoke out for us. And it was, but it was scary. I never actually thought we were gone, because I was pretty sure that there would be some, that some people who would intervene. But it was frightening. And then, after Frank left, we went through a period where we were once again reconsidering what we had done and whether we should have done it that way, what we ought to do next. And that was equally, I think, stressful.
It was that tension of, sorry.
You go ahead.
No, I'm
right.
sorry.
Let's get off the stress.
No, but just the tension between the hard news versus feature. And now, of course, you can get everything at NPR, but that was a really teenage, pubescent moment for the network, and trying to decide which way to go and how to evolve and who
It became inevitable for us, and for to me, very sad reasons. It's jumping from that point, 83, to much more recent times, as sadly, the newspapers of this country disappeared. Most towns had at least 2 newspapers. I think LA had 3 at one time. Washington did, other places. New York, I can't count how many there were there. But one by one, they folded. So sources for news shrank for hearing about the news. Television became opinionation rather than delivering news and showing news seriously. It's very hard to find that now on TV. So it ended up, we were the last guys standing, women too. There is no other place today, I believe, where you can turn to get fair, balanced, objective delivery of information as to what was happening in this world.
Not to mention edited.
And
Right.
Linda, as you pointed out before, that the heartland really was still is the fundamental backbone of the network. As you added stations, it was often stations in smaller markets that signed on to the network that gave your voice, heft all around the nation, at a time when that wasn't, national news was really just those 3 networks.
Something I didn't expect was that it was so easy to find people who had been listening to me all their lives. You walk down the streets in New York, there are a lot of people in New York who listen, but there are a lot of people who don't.
Yeah.
But out in the middle of the country, we have many friends, and it's always fun to go out and meet them.
Well, I found that in California, my first trip, because we were on all day there. We went on the air there at 2 p.m, and we didn't go off the air with repetition, rollovers, until maybe 10 at night or so. So everybody was a listener out there, and God bless the cars. I don't wish you that traffic, but it really helped us. It was like a huge light bulb going on in my head. Oh, really? I see. This is how it worked. Get stuck in traffic.
Before the death of newspapers, traffic saved us.
Yeah.
Right.
So did FM radio, which was available in every car off the manufacturing line. These days, I ask show of hands of young people, how many of you own radios? Not one hand goes up, because they've got these instruments that they can plug in and listen to in their ears, and also these podcasts. So there's not as much interest anymore in devoting 2 hours a day to a news magazine program in the morning and one in the afternoon, because it's much more on demand now, broadcasting, and that's where a lot of the creativity is.
But if you look at the history of what we did and when we did it, you see that we went up and then we went down.
Yeah.
And we went up and then we went down.
Yeah.
I mean, NPR has managed over a period of years to find another way to go if it was necessary to do that, and still come out sounding like NPR. We're still told by people all the time that when something bad happens, I look for a radio, I get down the end of the dial, and there you are, telling me what really happened. Mm-hmm. And that's a wonderful thing.
Yeah.
You could never have imagined that 50 years ago, could
you?
No. No. Hoped for, possibly, but not really expected.
We were very ambitious, and we were serious from the beginning. I mean, as well as playful and idiotic at times. The first anchor we had worked on the New York Times and ABC. I mean, Bill hired people of very, very good experience and very good background. And we had 5 reporters when we began, but we had a deal with the Christian Science Monitor, the newspaper, which was a very good paper in those days, that we had access to their correspondents who were all over the world. So I would make phone calls to Saudi Arabia and to China and to, anywhere where they had reporters and where news was breaking. And we could get the news on the air that way until we got our own. Robert Siegel was our first foreign correspondent, and he went to London. And he did a great job from the beginning, and a slight British accent too, which strangely, Linda, has never left him. And he's a New Yorker. Well, of course, you wouldn't know that I also was because of my great Southern accent, but Siegel came home British.
We skipped over in this conversation a lot. You talked a little bit about the tape and the clumsiness of the tape and how technology has moved ahead the news business. And I think I cover that in the book in a way that shows just everything's evolved over the course of your careers. Status of women, perception of women, perception of NPR, and I hope you go to sleep every night enormously proud that you did it. It must be so exciting for you, and it must be so exciting to have gotten to this point.
Yeah, yes, absolutely.
It's such great pride that we can take them. We've made something.
Wonderful honor. And the four of you have such different backgrounds that it made it a joy to sort of stitch together your stories. And I think Ted probably has a couple of questions for us right now.
Yes, we do. Thank you. Fascinating. Great stories. First question for each of you. Is there a news story that you feel shaped or greatly, influenced how you handle your news reporting today? Or is there a news story that stands out that meant a lot or mattered a lot to you that you covered or were part of covering?
Well, I think we talked about Watergate, which was our first huge one and the most persistent one, and just went on. And we had to not only tell what was happening every day and what we were learning, but also other ways to do it, other ways to get the story out going. And Linda carried this out while she was anchoring All Things Considered, and after she stopped doing that and went back to being a correspondent, hearing the country and going to the country, putting the country on the air with their own reactions to the dailiness of the news. That's something we began from the very beginning on All Things Considered, and particularly throughout Watergate, and continue to do regularly all the time. So I think that shaped our coverage, and it shaped our attitudes. Don't you think, Linda, as to what we felt we were doing and what the priority of that way of doing it was?
Right. I do think we did. I think it was very important to get people on the air. Now, I made a sort of a political career out of getting groups of people together who all knew each other. I thought that too many times focus groups got into arguments or just generally they were having moments of measuring just to try to see who was the manliest man around or whatever. And I got tired of it. So I got people together who all knew each other so that they would tell me what they really thought instead of getting into fights. And it was so interesting to do that. I found it fascinating. It was as if you walk out the door, you get 5 minutes away from NPR, and something flies up off the street and says to you, "I am a story." I remember when I walked in the morning after the Columbine shooting, and the person who was running the place at the time said, "Linda, we're sending you to Columbine." And I said, "Great, I'll go home and pack." She said, "Actually, no, we're sending you to Columbine now." So I went out to the airport, got on a plane, and got to Columbine. And almost, I think the third person I met was a man who had been driving home. He heard on the radio that there had been a shooting at Columbine. He stopped at a Walmart and ran in because there were television sets, and looked at the television sets and realized that it was a school where his children were. His wife had a similar experience. They came from opposite ends of the town. The streets were barricaded, so they couldn't meet. They had no cell phones. There they were, and their story for me became the, what people think of when a shooting like that occurs.
Yeah.
The family, one of the things that was interesting about them was that that everybody was apart and they couldn't get together. The husband and wife couldn't get together. The children, they didn't know where the children were. The children were holed up in rooms trying to hide from the guys who were shooting. And so we got them all together and they all told their stories. It was quite a wonderful thing.
Yeah.
I thought it was a wonderful thing.
That's the whole point of diversity, right? Of having a multiplicity of people behind the microphone asking the questions, because a man might have zoomed into Columbine as you had, Linda, and not had that same insight to
Gone for the chief of police.
people. Right, exactly. Exactly.
Sure.
Exactly. So that's a perfect example of why it's important to have various people holding the microphone. That's an
But
amazing.
it was
Well, my favorite
example.
My favorite example out of 9/11 was Robert Siegel on the street with microphones. But first, he started using the microphone. Before he started doing that, he was just looking around him. He was close to ground zero. And he saw the street littered with debris, pieces of paper, things that had fallen out of those towers. And he bent and picked up one or two pieces. And he noticed that they were CVs, they were resumes of people. And he took one of them and he took it into a studio and called the number, the phone number that was, I will never forget this. In fact, it's giving me chills now. Called it and the man answered. And it just turned out that he had an appointment to come for an interview for that job the next day or 2 days later. So his life was saved. But the thing about Robert that was so amazing and just so classy in my mind was he didn't put that guy on the air. He told the story. He kept the man away. I'm sure he was in deep shock and not ready to collect himself in any way. Or maybe he spoke, I can't remember this, maybe Linda does, spoke to the guy's wife. But he was able to tell the story. And it was such an insight into the quality of his reporting, but also such a respectful and dignified way to have dealt with that tragedy that we couldn't even describe in the beginning, couldn't believe.
Now, obviously, we all have, stories that were, for some reason or another, having to do with big events. But let me tell you a story about Linda interviews a guy who is a barbecue chef at his restaurant in Texas. And I said to him, how do you know when that big old piece of meat that you've got on the grill is done? And he said, well, here's what you do. You poke your forehead. And he did this. He said, if it feels like that, you throw it away. Then he said, you poke your nose. That's probably medium well. You poke your chin. That's medium rare. But that's not really the punchline of the story. The punchline of the story is I was sitting, driving home, listening to this on the radio, on the replay. And I looked at the next car and there was somebody going. And I thought, whoa.
This is great. Well, I got everybody to honk their horns about something once and learn back, at this moment, we know you're in your car. These were all things considered was designed to be a drive time program, as was so successfully Morning Edition when it followed us. And I asked people to please honk their horn if they agreed or if they were there or something on it. And horns blared out across the land. It was something. It's like conducting an orchestra.
We're talking, we're not leaving time for any more questions.
Yeah, let's hear some more.
All right, all of you have done television. What is it about radio that is more compelling than television? And do you feel threatened by podcasts eating into radio?
The pictures are better on the radio. That's the great advantage. You don't have to comb your hair. And yeah, I do feel threatened by podcasts. I wonder always privately how long programs, as we know them, are going to last, and how it will all divert to these individual elements, these portable things that you can play anytime you feel like it. I worry about that. And the pressure, the responsibility now with for good reporting that our network has, and that's reflected on our news magazines, have driven some of the most creative people off the staffs of the magazines, especially during the Trump administration, when the news was so relentless and exhausting that it made everybody just so tired and so ready to stop doing it for a while. And they went over to the podcast instead, where they can be far more creative. They don't have to put on that news girdle every day. They can play with sound. They can play with long interviews, which I used to do 20-minute reports on All Things Considered. That could never happen now. But they can do that, and they do long form things. And so I am concerned about that. I'm glad people have the attention spans for that. I was afraid that had disappeared. It hasn't, but it's moved somewhere else.
It does have the same quality that radio does, that you can, you can just hook up your little machine and poke it in your ear and go about your business. And that's always been one of the wonderful things. But radio, especially the way NPR has done it, we are in your house in the morning when you wake up. We're in your house while you have meals or cook meals. We're in your car when you drive home. Eventually, we all become very interlaced, and I feel as though it's not a mystery to me who's out there listening. I meet them all the time, and it's a wonderful thing. Now, I still meet a lot of nice young people, like you two nice young people that are here.
Thank you, Linda. Oh, yes. You don't mean me.
And they tell me, I've listened to you all my life. And I think,
and they mean it.
Can that be true? No.
Yes, it can be true.
And our final question, somebody says, a young college graduate approaches either of you and says, I'm thinking about going into journalism.
Yes.
Do you talk them into it, or do you talk them out of it? And if you talk them into it, what is it you advise them?
If you talk them into it, you tell them it is a noble profession and desperately needed. Democracy couldn't do without it, without really good, solid, unbiased, balanced journalism. But the other side of it is that the jobs are few and far between. There are very few places in which you can practice that craft and earn a living at it. Of course, we started out that way, but it's a double-edged sword, I think. Do you, Linda?
I would say that it's the best job you could have if you don't happen to want to do exactly the same thing every day.
Yeah.
Because you always are having to learn new things, do new things, meet new people. It's also true, when I was anchoring All Things Considered, anybody that I could think of that I wanted to talk to, I could talk to. I could just tell all of the young humans in the office, get them on the phone, and they would get them on the phone and we would talk. So, in many ways, it's a great and wonderful and incredibly entertaining job to have. What I would say, by way of advising young people, is that we invented public radio. It may be your responsibility to invent the next thing. I have no idea what that would be, but I'll be eagerly listening to hear what you make of it.
Yeah, good. To a large extent, I think it's the podcasts. That's what they're inventing.
Well, the thing about podcasts that I'm nervous about is are they edited? Does anyone edit a podcast?
Yeah, there are many are, yeah.
A lot of ex-NPR people are editing podcasts now.
Yeah.
They jumped over to podcast houses and
Okay.
That's it.
All right.
Yeah.
My cousins in Dallas listen to podcasts. I think, podcasts it is important, and it is kind of scary for me.
but I think you raise an excellent point that you did invent this format, and now who knows, podcasting is already out there. Who knows what's next?
Mhm. Mm-hmm.
But thankfully you don't have to worry about it. You
No,
can
no,
just observe.
but the eternal thing, eternity is there will always be the sound of human voices telling stories. That's how the first thing we hear when we're born is the human voice. And it's what we listen to throughout our lives. It's the way we spend our lives, to know what our experience has been and then tell it to somebody else, share it with someone. That will always continue.
What else could we possibly say after that? It's true.
We could say
Wonderful.
good night and good luck.
Yes, good night
Thanks,
and
thanks
good luck.
to Susan, and thanks Linda, and thank you Lisa Napoli for being the excuse for why this happened on this show. Again, Lisa Napoli's book is Susan, Linda, Nina, and Cokie, The Extraordinary Story of the Founding Mothers of NPR. It is available wherever books are sold, and a limited number of signed copies are available in the link below. Thanks, and go on gently.